What's up, everybody? Big Swede coming at you once again from Swede Studios. So, in response to the last video I did on my studio setup, I did get a couple people reach out to me and ask me to show a little bit more in depth how I have my patch bays set up to use some of my outboard analog gear. So I figured I'd put together a video today, talk a little bit of Patch Bay 101. And then I put together a diagram showing how I have everything set up so I can give you kind of a visual of the signal path into my patch bays. And then I figured I'd do like a walkthrough and show you how I would go about patching in some pieces of gear with the patch bays. If you're familiar with how patch bays work and all this stuff, this is going to be nothing new for you. But hopefully for somebody who's just getting into analog gear and wanting to set up a patch bay, hopefully this will be helpful for them. All right, before we get into how my patch bays are set up, let's just do a little bit of Patch Bay 101. First things first, when we're dealing with these diagrams, all we're talking about is the connections to the back side. We're not dealing with anything on the front panels yet, just the connections on the back. So with that out of the way a patch bay is normally set up, your top row is going to be connected to the outputs coming from your external gear. And then the bottom row is going to be connected to the inputs going to your external gear. I say normally because it doesn't have to be set up this way. You can set it up any way you want. But just the normal logical flow of outputs to inputs, think of it like a waterfall. Your signal flow comes into the top, it flows down, and then out into the next piece of gear. So, example would be like a microphone and an audio interface, right? So you have your microphone. The output of that comes into the patch bay, it flows down, and then goes out into the input of the audio interface. And then that's going to go into your DAW. All right, the next bit of Patch Bay 101 is going to be your modes. There's 3 modes that a patch bay can operate in. You have normal mode, you have half normal mode, and then you have through mode or non-normal mode. Now, depending on the patch bay you have, there's different ways of changing these modes. On the Samson S Patch Pluses I have, there's a switch on the front panel. Very easy to switch from normal to half normal to through. Other patch bays, you have to take it apart and actually switch the modules around. So you have to check your manual on how you switch those modes. But let me go into a little bit about what each mode actually does. All right, what normal mode is it's going to take the signal and automatically pass it from top to bottom into the next piece of gear without you having to do anything. No need to put patch cables into the front. It's just automatically going to pass that signal from top to bottom into the next piece of gear. Unless you were to take a patch cable and plug it into the top row. At that point, it's going to sever that internal connection, and it's now going to send signal wherever you take it with that patch cable. Now, where would this be useful? If you have a signal chain that you always run from one piece of gear to another, it might make sense to set that up in normal mode so you don't have to mess with cables. So you set the output from one, and it goes directly into the input of another, and you don't have to mess with cables. But you still have the opportunity to say, well, this time, I don't want to send it to that normal piece of gear. I want to send it somewhere else. And that's where you put a patch cable in and you send it to that other place. All right, now half normal mode is going to do something very similar. It's still going to take that signal and automatically pass it to the next piece of gear from top to bottom. But the difference is when you take a patch cable and insert it into the patch bay, it does not sever that internal connection. Instead, it's going to act like a splitter. So you're going to have essentially 2 signals now. You're going to have one signal being automatically routed to the bottom and out to the next piece of gear. And then you're going to have another signal routed to the patch cable, which you can then send somewhere else. Now, where might this be useful? If you're doing any kind of parallel processing. So let's say you have a microphone input and you want to record that, but you also want to record a version of it going through a compressor. So you would put your patch cable in, and now you're going to have that signal coming in, going direct to the audio interface, unprocessed, but you're also sending that signal out to a compressor, and then you would send the output of the compressor into your interface, and now you have 2 versions of that same audio, one unprocessed, one compressed, that you can then mix together in the DAW. And finally, we have through mode or non-normal mode, depending on the terminology your manufacturer uses. What this mode is there is no internal connection in the patch bay whatsoever. The only way to pass signal from one to another is to insert a patch cable on the front side. This is useful in cases where you're connecting pieces of analog gear that aren't part of a normal chain, that you don't always have hooked up, but you want to be able to patch them in and out. And that's kind of the way I have my second patch bay set up with all my analog gear. All right, now that we've got the basics out of the way, let's get into my actual setup. Now, as we talked about in the last video, I have two patch bays set up. The top patch bay is where all of my ins and outs are connected, and the bottom patch bay is where all of my outboard gear is connected. So if we start up at the top left up here, we have a 16-point XLR bay. Now, that is just for me to connect all my cables to start passing audio into the system. The outputs of that are then getting routed to the first patch bay. The top row, first 16, are the outputs from that XLR bay. Now those pairs are all normaled, which means that signal is automatically going to flow from the top to the bottom. And from there it goes out to the inputs of my Focusrite AT920 and the Octopre. And that gives me my 16 analog inputs into my DAW. 8 and 8, 8 for the AT920, 8 for the Octopre. Now, here's where I break from standard tradition, where I talked about before. Normally, outputs are at the top, inputs are at the bottom. You know, for the sake of keeping all of my inputs and outputs on one patch bay, the last 8 pairs, I have outputs on top and bottom. So the outputs of the AT920 I sent to the top row, and the outputs of the Octopre I sent to the bottom row. Now those are in through mode or non-normal mode, so there's no talk internal between those. So the bottom patch bay, as I said, is where all of my outboard gear is connected, and those are set up in through mode or non-normal mode. And the reason for that is, you know, I have these set up on pairs, so each piece of gear is on a pair, and it wouldn't make much sense for, you know, for the mic preamp, the WA273, it wouldn't make sense for the output of that mic pre to be sending signal to the input of the same mic pre. You're basically just creating a loop. It wouldn't do anything. So that's why you set it up in through mode rather than normal or half normal. That way, the only way to access that preamp is to insert patch cables to send it where you want it to go. All right, so now that we've gone over how everything is routed in and out of the patch bays, I'm going to change the camera angle here, and I'm going to walk you through a couple different scenarios of how I would patch in some different pieces of gear for both a tracking scenario as well as a mixing scenario. All right, let's say we want to record a vocal. All right, we have a mic, and it's plugged into input 1 of the XLR bay on the back. Now that signal is flowing into the patch bay right here at number 1. Now as we talked about, these first 16 pairs are all normaled. So if we do nothing right now, that signal is going to flow through and down to the input number 1 of the AT920. And it's going to go into our DAW, and we're going to record a completely clean, unprocessed vocal. Well, let's say we decide we want to add a little bit more character to that vocal. And we want to send it through this Warm Audio WA273 here, this British style mic preamp. Just give it a little bit of sauce, make it sound a little bit nicer. So in that case, we're going to take a patch cable. We're going to plug it into number 1 here, where our mic is coming in. And now, if you remember, we're normaled, so that is now going to sever the internal connection. So it's no longer automatically getting sent to input 1 of the AT920. It's getting sent to the end of this cable, which we are then going to stick into the input of the WA273. Now, if you can see on the meter here, we are getting input into this mic preamp. Now we got to get it out of there, so we're going to take another cable. We're going to plug it into the output of the 273 and back into the input of the AT920. And now we have a signal going from the mic into the preamp, out of the preamp, into the AT920, into our DAW. And now we can record that vocal going through this mic preamp. Well, let's take it a step further. Let's say we want to add this distressor. We want to compress that signal a little bit on the way in. Simple enough to do. So instead of sending the mic output to the 18920, we're going to send that mic output into the input of the distressor, which on my system is right here. And now if you look on the meters on the distressor, you can see the distressor is now getting signal. And then we just need a third cable to go from the output of the distressor back into the input of the 18920. And now we can record that vocal going through the mic preamp, through the distressor, back into the 18920, and we've got a really nice, rich sounding vocal. All right, let's look at a mixing situation. Let's say you got a session open and you decide you want to send some audio from the DAW out to a piece of outboard gear to process it and then back into the DAW. How do we go about doing that? Well, the first part of it is going to depend on the DAW that you're using. And I can't really go into that too much because, as I said, it's going to be different. So you have to get in there and figure out how to configure the sends and returns in your DAW to make this work. Now, for me using Studio One, I'm going to load up an instance of Pipeline, and I'm going to set up the ins and outs. And then all I have to do is come out to my patch bay and make the appropriate connections. Now, the example I'm going to use here is setting up my bus compressor on my mix bus. This will work for any piece of gear that you're wanting to set up. The only difference here is the bus compressor is a stereo signal, so I need to use 2 sets of cables versus just one if I was using a mono piece of equipment. So, first and foremost, like I said, in Studio One, I'm going to open up Pipeline, and I'm going to send my mix bus signal out to Octopre output 7 and 8. So I'm going to take my patch cables here and I'm going to plug them into 7 and 8. And then from there, I'm going to send them into my bus compressor, which is right here. And now, of course, I have to get that signal back into my DAW. So I'm going to send the outputs of the bus compressor into inputs 7 and 8 of the Octopre, which is how I have it set up in Pipeline. And simple as that, my bus compressor is now compressing that signal on my mix bus in the DAW. All right, hopefully that illustrates just how much of a time saver it is to have a patch bay in your system if you're using outboard gear. Like, imagine trying to do all of that stuff without one. Having to climb behind your gear and plug in cables and unplug cables just to change your signal chain. We all know what a rat's nest it looks like behind these pieces of gear. And, mine's mounted in a desk. So getting to the backside of these components, it's a big pain in the ass. So having this on the desk where I can just pick up a patch cable and plug in the components I need is a huge time saver. All right, well, hopefully that was helpful to any of you guys who are just starting to get your feet wet with outboard gear and patch bay setups. As always, if you have any further questions, feel free to hit me up. I will help you out any way I can. That's all we got for today. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. Stay tuned to the channel as the finale part 3 of the Harley Benton project is coming up real soon. And we got a couple quarantine session songs in the works as well, so stay tuned for that. And we'll catch you guys next time.